They say the wolves remember everything. Not in the way humans remember, not like photographs yellowing at the corners, not like half-forgotten songs you hum without knowing the words. Wolves remember with their blood. With the marrow of their bones. With the hollow ache behind their sternum that never fully heals after a loss. They remember with the deepest animal part of themselves, the part that existed before language, before stone walls, before the long careful work of becoming something that walked upright and built fires and learned to call itself a people. Mira Ashvane remembered the night her mother asked her father to leave quietly. She had been 7 years old. The year was the worst winter in 40 years, and the Thornwood Keep was cold in every room that didn't have a fire burning, and her parents' voices had been doing the particular thing they had been doing for months, too controlled, too measured, the deliberate flatness of two people holding something back for the sake of a child who was, in fact, crouched behind the thick velvet curtain in the hallway with her bare feet cold against the stone floor, listening to every word. She had heard her mother's voice, low, controlled, devastatingly calm, say those words without cruelty and without tears. Leave quietly, Idrin. Do not make this harder than it already is. There had been a long silence. The kind of silence that has a shape to it, that fills a room differently than ordinary quiet. Then the soft sound of her father's footsteps. The rustle of his traveling coat. The pause by the door that might have been a hesitation or might have been goodbye. The click of the great iron door. And then nothing. Her mother had not cried. Mira had cried enough for both of them, silently, behind that curtain, pressing her knuckles against her teeth so no sound could escape. She had been 7, and she had not yet learned that silent crying was a skill. She had only known, with a child's pure and terrible instinct, that this was a moment when sound would make things worse. So she held it all inside and she went cold and quiet and she watched through a gap in the curtain as her mother straightened her back, adjusted the lamplight, and went to her desk to review the evening's pack reports as though nothing had happened. As though the world had not just reorganized itself into a before and an after. That had been 17 years ago. Her father had never come back. Mira was 24 now, and she had learned her mother's lesson well. She kept her back straight. She did not cry loudly. She did not beg. She did not make things harder than they already were. She ran the Thornwood Pack with a quiet, unsentimental competence that had kept 300 wolves fed and housed and protected through droughts and brutal winters and the constant, grinding political pressure of being small in a world that respected size above most other things. She had built her life into something solid. Something that didn't need to lean. And then the Alpha King came to her border and ordered his warrior, Ren Varek, to seal the gate behind them, and Mira understood, with a clarity that felt almost like recognition, that something was about to change. She did not yet know if it would be terrible or extraordinary. In her experience, those two things were not always different. Chapter 1. The Thornwood Pack had always been small. 300 wolves, perhaps fewer in recent winters, tucked into the northeastern ridge of Caldenmore like a splinter under the skin of a much larger world. They were not weak, Mira had spent the better part of a decade making absolutely certain of that, but they were strategic in the way small things must always be strategic. They did not win by being the biggest. They won by being exact. By knowing their ground better than anyone else knew it. By choosing the right fights and, more importantly, by refusing the wrong ones. They survived by being careful. By being quiet. By staying exactly where the larger packs had agreed to leave them alone, and by making that agreement worth keeping through consistency and restraint and the kind of reputation that precedes actual conflict. Mira Ashvane, Alpha of the Thornwood Pack, was therefore deeply, profoundly unhappy when she rode to the tree line at dawn and found the banners. Gold and black. The crescent moon stitched across the center in silver thread. The banners of the Iron Veil Pack, the pack of the Alpha King himself, planted in her tree line with the precision of people who did not doubt their right to plant things wherever they chose. She pulled her horse to a stop and studied them. There were 7 banners visible from her position. Set in a line along the western edge of her border markers, each one driven deep into the frozen ground as though planted by someone who intended them to stay. The cloth was fresh, no wind weathering, no frost, which meant they had gone up very recently. Before dawn, perhaps. She had been sleeping when they planted banners in her tree line. That alone was enough to put an edge on her mood that would take most of the morning to file down. Beside her, her beta, a compact and watchful woman named Deva, said nothing for a long moment. Deva had the excellent quality of never filling silence with noise simply because silence was uncomfortable. She sat on her gray horse and looked at the banners and processed. Then, they're not attacking. No, Mira agreed. They're announcing. There was a difference, and it mattered. An attacking force did not plant banners in your tree line before dawn. An attacking force came without ceremony, without the deliberate theater of making sure you saw them coming. What this was something else. Something that required an audience. Something that wanted to be understood as a statement. How many? She asked. The scouts counted 40 riders at the ridge, Deva said quietly. But that's only the ones they could see clearly. If the king himself is with them. A king doesn't ride to a border negotiation with fewer than 100. Then we have approximately 100 Iron Veil wolves sitting in our forest. Mira breathed out slowly. The morning air was cold and carried the sharp bite of pine and frost. She could smell the Iron Veil wolves from here. Their pack scent was distinctive, something like cold iron and dark earth, nothing like the cedar and riverstone smell of her own people. The scent of strangers in her forest made something low and animal in her want to respond with her teeth. She breathed through it. Send word to the keep, she said. Full alert, but no weapons drawn. I don't want anyone doing something courageous and irreversible before I've had a chance to understand what we're dealing with. Deva turned her horse and was gone at a gallop. Mira did not move. She sat at the tree line and waited, because if the Alpha King was coming to her border, the least she could do was make him come to her. And because waiting, in her experience, was one of the most useful things a person could do. It sorted the patient from the impatient. It separated what was real from what was theater. It gave you time to think. She used it. He came at mid-morning. She heard him before she saw him, not his footsteps, which were nearly soundless on the frozen ground even in human form, but the quality of the silence that preceded him. The birds in the thornwood went quiet when he passed through them. The wind seemed to pull back, as though it, too, wished to give him room. And then the forest opened and Caius Drev, Alpha King of the Iron Veil, rode through her tree line on a black horse and stopped 20 feet away from her. He was not what she had expected. She had heard stories, of course. Every wolf in the Northern Territories had heard stories of the king. They had a tendency toward extremes. Either he was a monster barely containing his own violence, or a cold and brilliant tactician who had not felt a human emotion since before his ascension. The stories agreed on very little except that he was dangerous, and that he had not lost a territorial dispute in 9 years, and that packs much larger than the Thornwood had learned to think carefully before testing him. He was tall, that much the stories had right. Wide-shouldered, dark-haired, with the settled stillness of a predator who had long since stopped needing to prove itself to anyone. He wore a heavy riding coat with no ornamentation, which surprised her. Most men of his station wore their rank somewhere visible. His hands on the reins were calm. His expression was composed without being blank. His eyes, when they found hers across the distance, were the color of storm clouds. Gray, shot through with a darker gray, watchful and direct. Not cruel. That was the thing that surprised her most. Not kind, exactly. But not cruel. Alpha Ashvane, he said. His voice was low and even and carried without effort, the way the voices of people who were very used to being listened to often did. Your Majesty, she replied, matching his tone precisely, neither warm nor hostile, simply level. A pause. The corner of his mouth moved, barely, not quite a smile, but something close to acknowledgement. As though she had done something that met a threshold he had set. I would like to speak with you, he said. Alone. Behind him she could see the shapes of his warriors at the tree line. Enormous wolves, most of them, barely contained by their human forms. At the front, standing nearest to the king with the easy attention of someone who was permanently on alert without making it visible, was a man she recognized by reputation, Ren Varek. The king's shadow. His first warrior and closest guard, a name that had appeared in every intelligence report she had ever read about the Iron Veil. Alone, she said. With your 100 warriors in my tree line. My warriors will stay at the border. And your shadow? The king's expression did not shift. Ren goes where I go. Mira considered her options with the speed that years of alpha work had given her. She was being asked to receive the most powerful wolf in the northern territories inside her keep, accompanied by his most lethal warrior, with 100 Iron Veil wolves at her border. Every tactical instinct she possessed was flagging this arrangement. And yet, she was being asked. Not ordered. He had planted banners, not lit fires. He had ridden to her, not summoned her to Iron Veil. There was a specificity to the framing. The deliberate positioning of her as the person being approached rather than the person being managed, that felt intentional. She did not know yet what it meant. But she intended to find out. Very well, she said. Follow me. Chapter 2. The Great Hall of the Thornwood Keep was not grand by the standards of Iron Veil. Mira knew this and had no particular feelings about it one way or another. She had been in the Great Hall of Iron Veil once, as a young alpha attending a territorial council, and it had been enormous and cold and lit with more candles than anyone needed. It had also smelled, to her wolf senses, like the accumulated anxiety of hundreds of people who were trying very hard to appear unimpressed. She had found it exhausting. Her own hall was long and timber-beamed, with weapons on the walls and a fire burning in the central hearth that produced real heat rather than atmosphere. The Thornwood's banners overhead bore their mark, a bare tree against a bone-white moon, and the stone floor was worn smooth by decades of use. It was a hall that had hosted funerals and treaties and harvest celebrations and a great deal of very earnest tactical planning. It smelled like wood smoke and stone and the honest work of a pack that used its space. She watched Caius Drev walk into it and look around, and she waited, consciously, with the patience of someone who had been watching people assess her home for years, for the slight calibration of expression that wealthy and powerful people made when they encountered something less impressive than their expectation. It didn't come. He looked at the hall the way she looked at unfamiliar terrain. With focused, neutral assessment. His eyes moved to the weapon racks, to the high windows that served as her primary exits, to the fire, to her. Then he sat down at the long table without waiting to be invited, which might have been rude, or might have been a signal that he intended to conduct this conversation without ceremony. She chose to believe it was the latter and sat across from him. Ren Varek took a position at the far end of the hall, near the door, and became something very like invisible. He did not watch anything in particular, he watched everything. Mira had dealt with bodyguards before and she had a calibrated appreciation for the good ones, and Varek was, she could tell immediately, exceptional. She dismissed her own wolves with a look that told Deva everything necessary. Deva's answering expression communicated profound skepticism and the promise of an extremely thorough debrief later. Then it was 3 of them, and the fire, and whatever this was. You've been holding the northeastern border for 11 years, the king said. 12, Mira said. My mother held it before me for 9 years after my father left. I took over at 19. Something shifted in his expression at the word left, a small recalibration, not quite surprise, but a refinement of whatever model he had built about her before arriving. You were 19, he said. I was capable, she said. The border is still standing. I don't doubt it. He leaned back slightly in the chair, and the firelight caught the planes of his face and made them sharper. The Thornwood has held a border that 3 larger packs failed to hold in the century before your mother's time. I'm aware of the history. I've made a point of being aware of it. Then you know we don't need rescuing, she said. We're not in distress. We're not asking for intervention. So I'll ask directly, Your Majesty, what do you want? He looked at her for a moment with the quality of attention she had already noticed, focused, direct, without the social performance that most powerful people layered over their actual intentions. I have a problem, he said, that requires someone who understands this border. And I am informed by everyone I trust that there is no one who understands it better than you. What kind of problem? The Vasken Syndicate is moving through your territory. The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the thornwood with a sound like something breathing. Mira kept her expression still, though her pulse had done something sharp and complicated. The Vasken Syndicate. A network of rogue wolves, some estimates now place their numbers in the thousands, operating out of the unmapped territory south of Caldemore. They trafficked in things no wolf with any honor would traffic in. Pack intelligence. Bloodline records. The manipulation and dissolution of mate bonds for profit, selling the location of fated pairs to enemies or breaking the bonds themselves through black market rituals and psychological coercion. They had been operating for at least 15 years and growing steadily more sophisticated. They were a rot. Patient, spreading, methodical. And they were in her territory. The old ridge passage, she said slowly. The route through the northern cliff face. We believe so. That passage has been closed for 6 years. We blocked it after the spring floods compromised the lower trail. Someone reopened it, he said. 3 months ago. We have independent confirmation from 2 separate intelligence sources. Vasken runners have been using the northeastern ridge, your territory, as a transit corridor. 3 months. The tightness in Mira's jaw was not directed at him. It was directed inward, at the idea that something had been happening inside her borders for 3 months and she had not known. You should have told me the moment you had credible intelligence, she said. I'm telling you now. 3 months is not now. 3 months is how long verification took, he said, without apology but with something that was almost careful. I don't bring unverified intelligence to an alpha's table. If I had come to you in the first month and the information had been wrong, I would have disrupted your pack on a false premise. That is not acceptable to me. She studied him. He seemed to mean exactly what he said. It was a position she respected on principle, even while it annoyed her in practice. What are you asking? I want to station a unit in the Thornwood. 12 wolves, specialists in Vasken tracking and interdiction. They would operate under your authority. This is your territory, your sovereignty is not negotiable. But they have skills and intelligence resources that your pack doesn't currently have, and this problem needs both. He was asking. He had said your sovereignty is not negotiable. Not your sovereignty within certain parameters, or your sovereignty subject to Iron Veil oversight. Not negotiable. As a statement of fact, not a concession. She sat with this for a moment. And in return, she said. Whatever you need. I mean that as written, I'm not defining it in advance, because I don't know what you need and it would be presumptuous to assume. That's a very open-ended commitment for a king to make. I'm aware of that, he said. I'm making it anyway. Mira looked at the fire. She thought about her 300 wolves. She thought about the passage, and the runners moving through her land, and all the things she had not known were happening under her watch. She thought about what it would mean to bring Iron Veil wolves into the Thornwood, the politics, the risk, the leverage it gave him if he chose to use it. She thought about the way he had said your sovereignty is not negotiable. Give me until morning, she said. I'll give you my answer then. Of course. He rose from the table with a motion that was smooth and unhurried. Then he paused at the table's edge. Mira Ashvane, he said, and the sound of her given name in his voice was different from the formal title he had used at the border, and she noticed that difference before she could decide whether or not to. I was told you were formidable. I find the description was insufficient. She did not respond. He left. She sat at the long table and stared at the fire for a considerable time, and the fire did not give her any useful answers. Chapter 3. She found Ren Varek on her battlements at dusk. This was unexpected and mildly irritating, because the battlements were where she went to think when she did not want anyone to know she was thinking, and she had certainly not escorted him there. But she was also the alpha of this keep, and retreating from her own battlements because a guest had gotten there first was not a thing she was willing to do. So she walked to the opposite parapet and looked out over the thornwood without acknowledging him, which gave both of them the polite fiction of being there independently. The forest was deepening to blue-black in the failing light. In summer the thornwood was dense and green and smelled of fern and cool water. In winter it was something else, something stripped and essential, all bare branch and shadow and the particular silence of a forest that has gone quiet and turned inward against the cold. Mira had grown up in this view. She knew every tree line and frozen creek and lichen-covered ridge of it the way she knew her own heartbeat. The idea that people had been moving through it without her knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. "You're angry," said Varek, without turning from the view he was looking at. She glanced at him. He was leaning on the parapet with his forearms resting on the stone, and his voice had been matter-of-fact rather than confrontational. Not provoking. Observing. "I'm frequently angry about something," she said. "It keeps me attentive." The corner of his mouth shifted. "That's either efficient or exhausting." "Generally both." She looked back at the forest. "How long have you served him?" 8 years. "That's a long time to follow one person." "He's not an easy person to follow," Varek said. A pause. "He moves faster than people expect. Makes decisions that look wrong until they reveal themselves to be right. He is not comfortable, as a person, or as an alpha. He demands a great deal and he holds himself to even more. Most people find it taxing to be close to that for very long. But not you." "I find it interesting," he said, and there was something in the simplicity of this that was, itself, informative. "I'm telling you something," he added, before she could say it. "You are." "He didn't have to come himself," Varek said, still looking at the forest. "This kind of approach. It could have been handled by a representative, or by a written proposal, or by any one of 6 other mechanisms that wouldn't have required the King of Iron Vale to personally ride to a northeastern border at dawn and wait in someone else's tree line." He turned and looked at her directly. "He came himself." "I thought you should know what that means." Mira held his gaze. "And what does it mean?" "In 8 years," he said, "I have never seen him ride to a border himself." He pushed off from the parapet and went back inside, and his footsteps were quiet on the stone stairs, and then the battlement was empty except for her. Mira stood in the cold for a long time. She had been told things about powerful men before. She had dealt with them in every configuration that geography and politics produced. The ones who arrived with displays of force, the ones who arrived with flattery, the ones who sent intermediaries because they considered a border negotiation beneath personal attention. She had learned to read each type accurately and to give each one exactly what the situation required, which was sometimes compliance and sometimes refusal and sometimes the particular brand of careful indirection that kept a small pack safe without making unnecessary enemies. She had not been told, before, that a king had ridden to her border because he had decided to come himself. There was a difference between a man who came because his strategy required a personal visit and a man who came because he wanted to. She had been in this work long enough to know that the difference was rarely visible from the outside, and that most people who thought they could identify it were deceiving themselves. Varek had not deceived her. He had told her something specific and careful, and he had offered it freely, without being asked, which meant he had decided she should know it. A man who had spent 8 years at that king's side, who had survived 8 years at that king's side, did not give information carelessly. She looked out over the thornwood and let herself think about what it meant. Then she went back inside, because the battlements in January were not improved by extended contemplation, and because she had an answer to give in the morning and she needed the night to think through it clearly. She walked the keep that night instead of sleeping. She did this sometimes when her mind would not rest, moved through the building in the dark, checking things that did not strictly need checking, touching the walls of her own home in the private hours. Through the lower halls where the younger pack members slept with their easy wolf breath and their unself-conscious warmth. Past the training yard, empty and silver with frost. Through the storage rooms, where the winter provision tallies were chalked on slate boards in Deva's neat, economical hand. She was doing what she always did, accounting for her house. Making sure nothing had slipped past her, nothing was wrong, nothing had been missed. Her mother had taught her this. Walk the keep at night, Mira. Know your house the way you know yourself. Every weakness, every place where cold gets in. Her mother had also asked her father to leave quietly, and had then walked this same keep alone for 9 years, and had run the Thornwood through those 9 years with a composure so complete that most wolves in the pack had, by the end, simply forgotten there had ever been a time when the alpha had a partner at all. Mira had watched this and understood it as survival. She had also understood it, slowly and with a reluctance she rarely examined, as something that cost more than it appeared to. She came to the corridor where the guest chambers were and stopped. Light under the door of the king's room. A thin line of amber in the dark passage. He was awake. She stood there for a moment, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who lingered outside closed doors wondering about the people behind them. She acted or she did not act. She decided or she moved on. She moved on. But she thought about the light for the rest of her walk. Chapter 4. She gave him her answer in the morning before he had finished his first cup of whatever his people had made in her kitchen. He had been up before dawn. She knew this because she had been up before dawn herself, and the keep had the particular quality of alertness that happened when a guest was moving about, and he had the focused, unhurried look of a man who slept adequately in unfamiliar places. A useful quality for a king. Yes, she said, sitting down across from him. With conditions. He set his cup down. I'm listening. Your unit works under my command entirely. Not alongside it, not in coordination with it. Under it. They follow my orders or they leave. Agreed. Everything they find is shared with me in real time, before any action is taken anywhere in my territory. I am not receiving filtered intelligence or summaries. I am receiving everything. Agreed. If any of your wolves violate Thornwood Pack law, threaten or harm any of my people, or act in any way that I consider a breach of this arrangement, I will remove them immediately and the agreement ends. No appeals. Agreed. She paused, waiting. He had agreed to everything immediately, with no modification, no hedging. She had been prepared to defend her conditions. She had spent part of the previous night thinking through the likely pushback on each point. There was no pushback. You're not negotiating, she said. You're not asking for anything unreasonable, he said. Why would I negotiate? Because people in your position generally negotiate even on reasonable points. It establishes who has the authority to grant things. He looked at her steadily. This is your territory. Your authority over it isn't something I grant, it's something you have. I don't negotiate on things that aren't mine to negotiate on. She felt the small shift again. The slight adjustment of a thing that had been braced. One more condition, she said. Go ahead. The person who opened the passage. I want to conduct my own investigation inside my territory. Whatever I find, I tell you, you don't receive it simultaneously from your own sources. You learn it from me first. He paused. It was a real pause, not long, but noticeable in the context of how quickly he had agreed to everything else. That one is more complicated, he said. Why? The pause again. Shorter this time. Because we may already have relevant information about who it is. The fire between them was the only sound for a moment. Tell me, Mira said. He looked at her with an expression she was learning to read, not reluctance, exactly, but the specific weight of someone choosing to say a difficult thing cleanly rather than dress it in softening words. We believe the passage was opened by a member of the Thornwood Pack, he said. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Mira did not move. She kept her face still with the discipline of years. She held his gaze. She breathed. She was the alpha of this pack and she did not react to information about her pack in ways that she hadn't thought through, even when the information landed like a blade finding a gap in armor. Someone inside her pack had opened that passage. Someone she had fed and sheltered and trusted with her border. Who, she said. We have a scent profile from the passage and evidence of a regular contact point. Whoever it is, they'd been meeting Vasken runners at the old cairn on the western edge of the ridge. Once a month, consistently. Chapter 5. The western ridge in winter resisted visitors. The trail up to the old cairn was steep and iced in places, narrowing at one point to a ledge barely wide enough for one person, with a drop on the left side that was not deadly if you were careful but would make a very unpleasant story if you weren't. Above the ledge, the mountain face was wind-scoured and open, offering no protection from the northeastern gusts that came in from the high country with the flat, relentless cold of something that had been building momentum for 100 miles. Mira led the king and Varek into it herself. She would not send them unguided into her territory. She would not send subordinates on a task she should do herself. She wore her heavy pack coat, her weapons belt, and her most practical boots, and she set a pace that was fast and steady and invited no conversation, which both men seemed to understand and accept. The king moved well in the cold. Better than she'd expected from someone who, by all account, spent most of his time in halls and council rooms. He kept up without effort, his breathing controlled and unhurried, his attention moving as hers did. Sweeping the terrain, noting the places where the snow had been disturbed, where the trail angled, where a second approach might be possible. He was using his wolf senses, she could tell, and using them well. He had not forgotten the field, whatever years of kingship had done to him. Varek behind them was, as always, a shadow that happened to have a person inside it. The cairn was 2 hours out. A pile of stones older than any living pack, left by whoever had moved through these mountains before wolves came and claimed them. Mira had used it as a landmark since she was a child running the ridge with the Thornwood's young warriors. She knew its smell, cold granite, the dry mineral bite of its lichen, the faint whisper of snowmelt that collected in its crevices through the shoulder seasons. She smelled the other scent from 50 meters back. Strange and chemical, the particular quality of a masking compound, the kind of thing the Vasken runners were known to use to confuse wolf senses. Underneath it, faint but present, the cedar and riverstone signature of Thornwood. She stopped. The king stopped beside her. He had caught it too, she could tell from the slight change in how he was holding himself, the minute sharpening of attention. Recent, he said, very quietly. Within the week, she agreed. They approached carefully. Varek circled wide to check the perimeter while Mira and the king moved to the base of the cairn. The disturbed snow around it told a legible story, boot prints approaching from the south, from the direction of the pass, a pack set down near the northern face, the depression it left was still visible, a clear spot where two people had stood facing each other, marks of departure going in two different directions. Two people had met here. The Vasken runner coming up from the south. Someone from the Thornwood coming down from the north. Mira crouched and looked at the Thornwood prints. The right foot turned slightly inward with each step. A distinctive gait, compensatory, the long-term adaptation to an old knee injury. She had seen it every day for 3 years. Her jaw tightened. "You recognize something," the king said, beside her. "The walk," she said. "The right foot. I know whose boots leave that print." She straightened and looked at the cairn for a moment. "His name is Oren. He's 22. He came to the Thornwood 3 years ago from a dispersed pack in the Caldemore lowlands. He's one of my best young trackers." She paused. "He lost his mate to Vasken runners 18 months ago. She disappeared from a border run. We searched for 2 months and found nothing." The king said nothing for a moment. Then, "They told him they know where she is." "That's my guess," she said. "Proof of life, a photograph, a promise. Keep the passage clear, report pack movements, and they'll return her." She looked at the boot prints. "It's what they do. They find the open wound and they put something in it." "Can they return her?" "I don't know." She turned back toward the trail. "But I'm going to find out. And then I'm going to deal with this myself. Without making Oren into a casualty of something that was done to him." They made the walk back in silence mostly. The sky had gone the specific blue-white of a winter afternoon moving toward dusk, and their breath came in small clouds that dissolved as they walked, and Mira thought about Oren and about Lisa and about the particular, grinding cruelty of people who understood how to weaponize grief. She was aware, in a peripheral way, of the king walking beside her. Not intrusively, he was not a man who required conversational coverage for silence. He walked in the quiet the way some people did, comfortably, without needing to fill it. Which was, she noted privately, one of the more reliable indicators of a person worth knowing. "What will you do?" he said, when the keep came into view below them. "I'll speak to Oren. Alone. Tonight, before anyone else knows what we found. Not have him detained. He's not a criminal. He's a young wolf who lost his mate and was handed a lifeline by people who are very skilled at finding young wolves who have lost someone and handing them lifelines." She glanced at him. "I'm going to help him. And then, through him, I'm going to find out exactly how far the Vasken network runs." A brief silence. "That's a better strategy than arrest," he said. "Most things are," she said. He made a sound that in a less controlled man might have been a laugh. She kept her eyes on the trail and did not acknowledge it. But she smiled, briefly, at the path in front of her feet, where no one could see it. Chapter 6. She sent for him after supper, when the keep was winding down toward night and the corridors had the quiet of a pack settling. He came immediately, which told her that he had been expecting the summons. He had the look of a man who had been waiting for a particular door to open for months, and who was simultaneously relieved and terrified to see it finally moving. He was a lean young wolf with the watchful stillness of a natural tracker, and he had always reminded Mira slightly of a hawk, precise, observant, built for focus. He had been one of the best she had, and she had relied on him, and the weight of that trust was currently sitting somewhere under her sternum in a way that she was choosing, deliberately, not to be ruled by. He sat in the chair across from her desk and looked at his hands as though the answers to questions he had not yet been asked might be somewhere in his palms. "I know about the cairn," Mira said. Oren's eyes closed. "I know about the passage, and the meetings, and what they told you about Lisa." She kept her voice level, because she needed him present, not spiraling. "I also know that you did what almost anyone would do in your position. What many people I respect would have done. You were alone and afraid and someone held out the one thing you needed most in the world." He looked up. His eyes were red and dry, the particular look of someone who had spent months not allowing themselves to cry. "She's alive," he said. His voice was rough. "They showed me a photograph. She was holding a newspaper with a date. They said if I kept the passage clear and let them know when border patrols changed, when scouts went out, they'd..." He stopped. Pressed his fist against his mouth. Continued. "They said they'd bring her back to me." "I know," Mira said softly. "I know what I did," he said. "I know what it cost. If people had been hurt because of information I gave them, if Vasken runners had come through the passage and attacked pack members." His voice cracked fully and he let it. "I'm sorry, Mira. I am so sorry." "I know that too," she said. "And I believe you." She leaned forward slightly. "Now I need you to listen to me carefully. I want you to hear what I'm about to say, not what you think I'm about to say." He looked at her. "I want to get Lisa back," she said. "That is the priority. Not accountability. Not punishment. Lisa. I want her home. And everything else is secondary to that goal." He stared at her as though she had said something in a language he had prepared for but not expected to actually hear. "You're going to tell me everything," she said. "Every contact. Every drop point. Every piece of information they asked for and everything you told them. All of it, as completely as you can recall it. And then we, the Thornwood, and the Iron Veil unit, are going to use what you know to find Lisa and bring her home, and to close the network that has been using this territory." Oren put his face in both hands. His shoulders shook with the release of something that had been held too long, under too much pressure. Mira sat across from him and let the silence have its necessary shape. She did not rush it. She had learned, in years of sitting with people in their worst moments, that patience here was not passivity. It was the specific kind of care that said, I am not going anywhere. You are not alone in this. Take the time you need. When he was steadier, she asked her questions. He answered them for over an hour, with the systematic, detailed recall of a trained tracker who had been storing information with nowhere useful to put it. Contact names, or the identifiers the Vasken runners used in place of names. Meeting times. Frequencies. The specific information they had requested and how much of it he had given and what he had withheld. He had withheld more than she had expected. He had been careful, even in his desperation. He had given them operational schedules but never personal details of wolves. He had confirmed border timing but never compromised scout identities. He had been doing, as best he could, the least harmful version of a terrible thing. It did not make it right. But it mattered. She sat with him for another half hour after the information was exhausted, because the information was not the whole thing. He needed, she could see, to be in the presence of someone who knew the full shape of what he had done and had not left the room. Who was still sitting across from him. Who was still his alpha. This was also part of the job. Not the administrative part, not the strategic part. The fundamental part, the thing that made the difference, in the end, between a pack that held together under pressure and one that fractured. You stayed in the room. You kept being there after the worst had been said. When she finally stood, he stood too, and his face had the specific quality of someone who has been very afraid of a moment for a long time and has discovered that the moment, while hard, was survivable. What do I do now? He said. His voice was steadier than it had been. You sleep, she said. And tomorrow you help us. And that's the whole of it, for now. He nodded. At the door he stopped. Mira. He didn't turn around. Thank you for not, he stopped again. Started again. Thank you for how you did this. She said nothing. But she heard it. She found the king in the corridor afterward. He was leaning against the stone wall near the end of the passage with his arms folded, and he was not hovering. He was simply available, positioned at the edge of the situation in case he was needed, far enough back to give her the space the conversation had required. She stopped beside him. You heard some of it. Enough to understand the shape of it, he said. He held more back than he gave them. It wasn't clean, there was real damage to operational security, but he tried to minimize it. I could hear that, he said, in how you were talking to him at the end. She looked at him. Lisa. If she's in a Vasken holding site, your intelligence network covers more territory than mine. I need to know if there's any trace of her. Ren will pull everything we have tonight, he said immediately. If she's findable, we'll find the thread. Thank you. She said it without performance, just directly, the way she meant it. He looked at her for a moment with the quality she kept noticing, that slightly open, slightly careful thing. Mira, he said, and then stopped. She waited. He seemed to decide something. Nothing. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. It wasn't what he had been about to say. She knew this with certainty. She also found that she didn't mind. Some things were better said when they were ready. Chapter 7. The plan came together in 48 hours, which was faster than Mira had expected and probably exactly as fast as she should have expected once she understood what the Iron Veil unit actually was. Sable, who led the 12-wolf team, was a woman of perhaps 40 with close-cropped silver hair and the economy of movement of someone who had spent decades refusing to waste effort. She spoke rarely. When she did, it was to say things that saved time. In the first planning session, she identified 2 operational weaknesses in Mira's initial proposal, proposed solutions for both, and then sat back and waited for the next problem. Mira revised her assessment of the Iron Veil unit upward within the first hour. They worked around the long table for 2 days. The intelligence Ren had pulled overnight confirmed a Vasken holding site approximately 90 kilometers south. A former mining compound, fortified and currently housing roughly 60 Vasken operatives. More importantly, it listed 5 involuntary detainees currently at the facility. One of the descriptions matched Lisa in age, physical profile, and pack origin. Oren had held himself together when Mira told him this, just barely. The planning was good work, the kind of work Mira had always found clarifying, the way that complex problems became manageable when broken into their component parts and distributed across capable people. There were arguments. The king pushed back on her proposed entry timing on the eastern wall, and he was right, and she adjusted it. She overruled Sable's preferred extraction route in favor of one that protected the detainees better at the cost of slower movement, and she defended her reasoning when challenged, and no one pushed further because her reasoning was sound. The king participated as a member of the planning team, not as the senior authority overriding it. He had opinions and he stated them, and when her judgment differed from his, he engaged her reasoning rather than simply asserting rank. It was, she thought privately, the best tactical work she had done in years. The night before the raid, the keep was quieter than usual. The wolves who would run tomorrow had been resting all day by order. The planning room had been cleared and locked. The fires in the hall were low, and the building held the particular held breath quality of the hours before something significant, when everyone is simultaneously trying to sleep and unable to. Mira was in the hall alone when he came in. She didn't look up from the fire she had been watching for the past hour. "You should sleep." "So should you," he said. He sat down on the bench nearest the hearth, not at the table, which would have been formal, but closer, at the edge of the fire's warmth. The silence that followed was the particular kind she had learned to identify in the past few days. Not the silence of two people who had run out of things to say, but of two people who were comfortable enough to stop filling space and simply exist in the same place without it requiring justification. She had not felt this way with many people. "I was 15, he said, eventually, without preamble, when I understood what the Vasken Syndicate actually was. My father had just broken up a trafficking network in the Western Territories. I went with him to see the survivors." He paused. His hands, resting on his knees, were still. "I have never forgotten what I saw," he said. "I think about it whenever someone asks me why I spend as much political capital as I do on this particular problem, when there are other problems with more immediate territorial implications. It is not a strategic priority that most councils would choose. But I choose it." Mira looked at the fire. "How much have you ended?" "Of the network." "Fragments." "Nodes." "We've closed operations and disrupted supply lines and recovered people. But the network is resilient, it disperses when pressure hits one point and reconstitutes elsewhere." He looked at the fire too. "This is the closest we've been to a genuine fracture in 6 years. The northeastern corridor is a major transit route. Closing it doesn't end them, but it damages them meaningfully. And the information Oren has about their contact protocols. If it's accurate, and I believe it is, it gives us identifiers we can use to trace 2 other nodes." Mira absorbed this. "Then, why did you come yourself?" "Truly." He turned to look at her. "Because I wanted to meet the Alpha of the Thornwood," he said. "Because in 6 years of working this problem, this border has been the one place I couldn't get a foothold without the cooperation of the Alpha who runs it. And every report I received about that Alpha described someone I thought I might actually be able to work with. And because," he stopped. "And because," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that careful, particular thing. "Because I was tired of sending representatives," he said, which was not quite all of what he had been about to say, but was, she thought, as much of it as he could say tonight. She looked at the fire. She thought about her mother. She thought about how she had made her mother's composure into a fortress and lived inside it for years, and how the fortress had kept her safe and kept her separate in equal measure. "Caius," she said. He turned. It was the first time she had used his name. She could see that register. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "I'm glad you came yourself." He was quiet for a moment. The fire spoke between them. "So am I," he said. She did not push further. She sat with him by the fire for another hour, and they did not speak again, and it was not empty. She thought, once, in the deep quiet of the second hour, that she should probably go to bed. She was going on limited sleep and the operation was in 5 hours, and she had learned long ago that there was no tactical situation that was improved by an exhausted commander. She stayed. The fire burned down slowly, and the halls settled around them, and the particular quiet of a keep in the deepest hours of the night was like being at the bottom of something, a valley, a held breath, where the world paused before it turned back toward morning. "My mother," he said at one point, not to begin a conversation but simply placing the words in the space between them, used to say that the worst thing a ruler could do was confuse what they wanted with what they were owed. I have spent a great deal of my adult life thinking about that sentence. What do you think she meant? Mira said. That wanting something does not give you the right to it. And that most of the harm powerful people do comes from forgetting that. He looked at the fire. I try not to forget it. Do you succeed? He was quiet for a moment. More than I used to. Less than I would like. She looked at him. That is an honest answer. I find, he said quietly, that honesty is considerably easier with you than with most people. I am still determining whether that is a quality of you specifically or simply something I have been more willing to attempt this week. Mira looked at the fire. Does it matter which? A long pause. Then, very quietly, no. I suppose it does not. Chapter 8. The raid began at 3 in the morning under a sky that had gone completely clear, which was either a good sign or an irrelevant one, and Mira had never been especially interested in omens either way. She ran the first 2 hours of the approach in her wolf form, which was her preference when covering difficult terrain at speed. Her gray wolf was low to the ground and built for endurance, and she knew every irregularity of the landscape between the Thornwood and the southern ridge as she knew her own hands. Ice fields, exposed rock, the 2 creek crossings where the ice was thin and needed to be taken wide. She ran it without thought, trusting the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime. The king ran beside her. His wolf was larger than she had expected. She had a rough sense of his size in human form, but in wolf form the power of him was more apparent. Dark-furred and deep-chested, with a stride that covered ground with quiet efficiency, not flashy, not aggressive, simply very effective. She had spent her life running alongside large wolves and she had a calibrated sense of what effort looked like versus what ease looked like. He was running easily. Which meant his true capability was something beyond what she was seeing. She filed this away. They hit the compound from 3 sides at exactly the agreed time. Sable's unit came over the eastern wall. Deva led the Thornwood wolves through the northern gate with the kind of controlled ferocity that Mira had spent a decade developing in her warriors, precise, committed, deeply uninterested in showing off. Mira and the king and Varek took the main entrance. The fighting was hard and fast and ugly in the way real conflict always was, stripped of everything that was not immediate and necessary. The Vasken operatives were not undisciplined, they had experienced fighters. People who had been doing this for years in various capacities, and they knew their ground. But they were operating reactively, responding to 3 simultaneous threats with a command structure that could not coordinate quickly enough. Mira fought with the cold efficiency she had built over 20 years of training and the last decade of actual use. She read the space around her the way she read the ridge in winter, constantly, without commentary, just adjustment. She was always aware of where the king was. Not because of sentiment. Because in a coordinated fight, your partner's position is part of the tactical picture, and if you're not tracking it, you're fighting half-blind. He fought the way he ran, clean and powerful and precisely economical. No wasted motion. Nothing extra. At the second ring of the compound, 3 Vasken operatives broke through Varek's position. Mira was managing 2 of them and calculating the angle on the third when the king was simply there, between her and the incoming threat, handling it before the geometry had fully developed. Not sweeping in dramatically. Just, completing the picture. Filling the gap. The way people who think the same way in high-pressure situations do, she thought, in the half-second she had to think it. And then there was no more time to think anything, and there was only the work. It was over in 40 minutes. 63 Vasken operatives detained. 0 Thornwood or Iron Vale wolves killed, 4 injured with non-critical wounds. 11 detainees located in the underground cells, alive. Among them, Lisa. She was alive. She was not unharmed. 18 months of Vasken captivity did not leave a person unharmed. But she was present and coherent, and when Oren, who had been waiting with the rear guard and whom Mira had brought forward specifically for this moment, came into the cell block, Lisa made a sound that was composed of pure and simple recognition. A sound that said, "I knew. I always knew you would come." Mira looked away to give them the moment. She found the king standing at the entrance to the cell block, watching the perimeter, his back to the reunited pair. He had given them their privacy in the same way she had. She stood beside him. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "This is one node. There are others. I know. But it's a beginning." She looked at the compound around them. The dismantled operation, the detained wolves, the 11 people who had come out of those cells and were now standing in the pre-dawn cold, blinking at the sky like people being reminded that the sky existed. A real one. He nodded. He was tired, she could see it now, in the way he was standing, the slightly lowered quality of the vigilance he normally held so high. It was, she thought, the most human she had seen him look. The most like a person rather than a position. "You fought well," she said. He looked at her. "So did you." A pause. "You filled the gap on the third runner," she said. "How did you know where I'd need you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't tracking where you'd need me. I was tracking where you were." He paused again, as though listening to what he had just said. "I find I do that." Mira looked at the lightning sky. She considered saying something practical. Something professionally appropriate. She had a whole repertoire of those. She did not use any of them. "I know," she said instead. "I do the same." He turned to look at her, and something moved across his face, not surprise, but the specific quality of a held breath released. The sky above the compound was turning from black to the pale cold gold of a winter dawn. Beyond the tree line, the first birds were beginning. The ordinary persistence of the world, continuing past all of it. "We should check on the detainees," Mira said. "Yes," he said. And they went back inside together. Chapter 9. He stayed 4 more days. The official reasons were real and plentiful: coordination reports, the formal treaty addendum, the processing of the Vasken prisoners and the complex logistics of their transfer, the care and transportation of the 11 detainees, 2 of whom needed medical support that the Thornwood's healers provided. There were debriefs and documentation and the administrative follow-on of a major operation. Real work. They did it. But it did not account for all 4 days. He joined her on her morning walks through the Thornwood, which were not scheduled events and were not invitations extended. He simply appeared, at a reasonable distance, and fell into step beside her when she made no objection. She did not make one. The walks were better for conversation than the planning room, and the planning room had been where they had done their best work, and she had begun to understand that this man thought most clearly when he was moving, which was something she recognized because she was the same way. They talked about things that were not the immediate operation. He asked about her mother. Not intrusively, a single question, carefully placed, that opened the door without pushing through it. She answered more than she expected to. She told him about the walk the keep practice, about the 9 years after her father left, about taking the alpha position at 19 with a mixture of readiness and grief that she had not, until now, described to anyone in those terms. He listened without redirecting. Without making it about himself. Without offering solutions to things that were not problems that needed solutions. She asked him about Iron Vale. About what it had cost him to become what he was. About the difference between the person he had been at the beginning of his kingship and the person he was now. He answered with a directness that surprised her, not performing openness, but actually being open, in the way of someone who had decided to trust and was doing it straightforwardly. Deva, one morning, appeared at Mira's office door, took in whatever expression was or wasn't on Mira's face, and raised one eyebrow to the precise angle that said everything she had decided not to say aloud. Mira looked at her in pointed silence for long enough that Deva smiled and withdrew. On the evening of the third day, Lisa came to find Mira. She was still moving carefully, still healing, but she was present in herself in a way that suggested that the essential thing, the core of who she was, had survived intact. She sat with Mira for an hour and told her what the Vasken holding site had been like, and Mira listened without flinching, and when Lisa was done, Mira told her she was safe now, which was not a promise she had ever made lightly. He never stopped believing, Lisa said, meaning Oren. I could feel it. Even when I couldn't feel anything else. She paused. You're Alpha King, the one who planned the raid, who is he to you? Mira looked at her steadily. An ally. Lisa looked at her with the clear, unimpressed eyes of someone who has recently been through something terrible and has no patience left for anything that isn't accurate. An ally, she repeated, with a quality that made it clear she had found this answer incomplete. Mira said nothing else. But she sat with the word afterward, in the quiet of her office, and found it felt thinner than it had a week ago. On the fourth evening, she and Caius stood on the battlements. It was the clearest night since winter began, the kind of cold that made the stars very sharp and close, as though the sky had been pressed flat and the light through it was more direct. The thornwood below them was silver and black and still. Somewhere in the forest an owl was calling, and the sound carried clean and far in the frozen air. Mira had a cup of tea. The steam rose and dispersed. She realized, content. Not in the absence of difficulty, there was still the treaty to finalize, and the larger Vasken network still existed, and Lisa's healing would take months, and the northeastern corridor would need new protocols, but content in the way that meant something real. Something located in the present rather than the future or the past. You're going back tomorrow, she said. I have to, he said. Iron Vale needs its king. I know. A silence. Comfortable and not enough. Come back, she said. Not a request, precisely. Not an order. Something between the two. Direct, the way she was always direct when she had decided something was worth being direct about. He turned to look at her. That's very direct, she said. Yes. I know. Come back. Something happened in his expression. The careful opening of something that had been careful for a very long time. Mira Ashvane, he said, with the deliberate tone of a man who has made a decision and is moving through it. Yes, she said, before he could continue. He stopped. Looked at her. You didn't let me finish. You were going to say something about coming back and what that would mean and how you intended to handle it. You were going to be very clear about it. A beat. Yes. Then yes, she said. To all of it. Whatever you were going to say. He looked at her for another moment. And then he laughed. She had heard him make sounds approaching a laugh before, but not this. Not fully, not without constraint. It was warm and sudden and entirely unguarded, and it was, she thought, possibly the most appealing sound she had heard in several years, which she also chose not to examine too carefully just at this moment. You are, he said, when the laugh had run its course, extraordinary. I'm efficient, she said. That too. They stood together on the battlements in the cold and the starlight, their shoulders close enough that on the next gust of wind, which came from the northeast with the smell of pine and high country and the long approaching spring, she felt the warmth of him beside her. She thought of the click of the great iron door. She thought of her mother's straight back. She thought of walking the keep alone, counting all the things that were accounted for, making sure nothing had slipped through. She thought, I have been very good at keeping things out. She thought, perhaps that was enough of that. Epilogue. 3 months later, when the first thaw had broken the grip of the long winter and the thornwood was beginning to smell of green things and mud and the first thin runoff from the high snowfields, the Alpha King of Iron Vale came back to the northeastern border. He came without his full retinue. Just Ren Varek and 4 others, riding through the early spring morning with the gold and black banners loose in the mild breeze. The snow had pulled back from the lower trails and left the earth dark and exposed, and the thornwood's bare branches were beginning to show the first tentative swelling of buds, and the whole world had the particular quality of something emerging from a long-held breath. Mira did not ride out to meet him at the tree line. She left the gate open. It was Deva who saw them first, from the upper window of the keep where she had been reviewing the spring planting schedules and, Mira strongly suspected, watching for the Iron Veil riders in a way she would deny if asked. She appeared at Mira's office door with the expression of someone who has been proven right about something and is exercising great discipline not to mention it. "He's here," she said. "I know," said Mira, who had smelled them on the spring wind from half a mile out, and who was reviewing the spring provision count with a focus that was partially genuine and partially a performance for her own benefit. "He brought things," Deva said. Mira looked up. "What things?" "Plants. In ceramic pots. He has an entire pack horse loaded with them." A pause during which Deva's expression remained carefully neutral in a way that required significant effort. "Flowering things." Someone told one of his riders that he looked up what grows well in Thornwood soil specifically. "And what blooms in spring at this altitude?" Mira set down her provision reports. She looked at the window. She looked at the provision reports. She made a decision with the characteristic speed she applied to most decisions once they were actually clear. She stood up. He was in the lower courtyard when she got there, having dismounted and handed his horse off to the groom, standing in the spring morning with the second horse on a long line beside him. The pack saddle was indeed laden with small ceramic pots, each one carefully wrapped in burlap against the travel, and he was looking at the courtyard with the expression of a man who has arrived at a destination and is very deliberately not assuming the welcome. He looked up when she appeared. Mira looked at the pots. Then at him. "Bluebells," he said, after a moment. "And witch hazel, which she said does well in northern shade. And something called mountain laurel. The merchant said it takes 3 years to establish properly, but then it's there for decades." He paused. "I am aware that arriving at someone's keep with a pack horse full of flowering plants is not the most dignified manner in which a king has ever made an entrance." "No," Mira said. "It isn't." He waited. "It's the best manner," she said. He smiled, fully, the way he had laughed on the battlements, without any of the careful management he usually placed between himself and the world, and the spring morning was bright and cool around them, and the Thornwood gate was standing open behind her, and Ren Varek, somewhere near the gate, was looking at the sky with the expression of a man who is extremely preoccupied by clouds. She showed him where the mountain laurel would go, the long southern wall that caught the most light, where the stone held warmth into the evening. He carried the pots himself, declining the groom's offer, and they moved along the wall together in the mild morning while the pack went about its business around them and the Thornwood breathed its slow spring breath. She told him about the treaty addendum revisions. He told her about the 2 Vasken nodes they had disrupted using the contact identifiers from Oren's information. She told him about Lisa's progress, which was slow and real. He told her about a 3rd node they were closing in on in the south, and what it would mean if they could collapse it before summer. Real work. Shared work. The kind that had a future attached to it. Oren planted the mountain laurel along the southern wall that afternoon, kneeling in the dark spring earth with the focused care of someone who understood that some things required patience to grow. Lisa sat on the bench nearby in the afternoon light, and the look she gave Mira across the courtyard was full of a quiet, complicated gratitude that Mira received with a nod. Deva would later claim, with the serene confidence of someone who had been right about something important, that she had seen all of this coming from the very first morning the Iron Veil banners appeared in the tree line. She would be correct, and no one would challenge her on it, because she had in fact seen it coming from the first morning. Ren Varek would say very little, as was his way. But he told Mira once, in the spring, in the corridor outside the planning room, in the quiet voice of someone relaying something that mattered, that the king had been different since he started coming to the Thornwood. That there was a quality to him now, an ease, that 8 years of service had not produced. That he seemed, in whatever way a person who had carried a great deal for a very long time might seem, lighter. Mira received this. She thought about it for a long time. That evening, She and Caius sat in the great hall with the fire between them and the spring dark beyond the high windows, and she thought about her mother's voice, calm, controlled, devastatingly gentle, saying leave quietly. She thought about all the careful management of her own interior, the long practice of holding herself together and holding others at the precise distance she could manage without losing what she needed to function. She thought, it was good work. It had been necessary work. It had kept her alive and kept her people safe and kept her standing through every winter and every crisis and every moment when a lesser kind of self-protection would have collapsed. She was grateful for it. And she was done with it as the primary mode. Because the gate was open. The gate was standing open on the long spring evening, and the light was coming through it, and Caius Drev, Alpha King of the Iron Vale, who had ridden to her border himself because he was tired of sending representatives, was sitting by her fire, and she was not making anything harder than it needed to be. She was simply, deliberately, with her eyes clear and her back straight and the full weight of who she had become behind the decision, letting something in. Mira spent 17 years asking people to leave quietly. One king refused. If this story found you, if you know what it costs to keep every gate closed, leave a wolf in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe if you're new to the pack, hit the bell so you never miss a story, and share this with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to finally open the gate. I'll see you in the next one.